Hello. Welcome to Top 50 Right-Wing Liars, a offshoot of Top 50 Right-Wing Lies. I am an ethereal being from the realm of light, and today we're going to be talking about a statement put out by Sean Last. Now, Sean Last, he's smarter than me. He's probably nicer to his family. He's loyal to his friends, you know. This is not a... I don't know who Sean is personally. I don't know his personal life. I don't know his character as a man. I just know that he's telling lies, whether he knows it or not, whether he's self-conscious as a liar, as a deceiver, or whether this is a small part of his ideology or a big part of it. I don't really know the answers to those questions. But the tweet by Sean goes something like, you know, in response to give you the context first, you know, Biden comes out at this press conference and he says, you know, all these gun nuts, all these Second Amendment people who believe that guns are going to protect them from the government, you're going to need nuclear weapons. And I basically agree with our great President Biden. I agree that if you really want to protect yourself from the government, you have to be in your own independent government, because the state or a government is not, according to this libertarian theory, it's not an inefficient institution. The state or the government is simply a certain level of human organization. You can have a capitalist state, a communist state, fascist state, democratic state. You can have different types of organization. You can say that some types are more efficient than other types, but ultimately, a state is simply a form of a corporation with a monopoly on violence. So I mean, to deny the efficiency of the state within a libertarian framework is to say that corporations are less efficient with violence. You can make some kind of competition argument or something. But really, we have to look at the specific claim being made rather than get bogged down in, you know, is the government better at making shoes or is Coca-Cola better at making shoes? You know, rather than get bogged down in those irrelevancies and side issues, let's focus on the question of war, because, you know, war making in itself, well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about war making, what war making is, how it relates to the profit motive, and all of these things. So, Sean, in response to President Biden, says something like, well, listen here, Jack. The United States of America has been losing wars. We've been losing wars against powers which did not have nuclear weapons in Vietnam, in Afghanistan. And therefore, this is proof that in order to defy the government, you don't need nuclear weapons, because the Vietnamese did not have nuclear weapons. And similarly, the Taliban did not have nuclear weapons. And the fact that these forces defeated America proves that you don't need nuclear weapons to defeat America. Now, this statement is a lie. The statement is a big fat lie on a number of levels. First of all, it assumes that America lost the war in Afghanistan, and it lost the war in Vietnam, and other little wars as well, maybe the war in Korea or whatever you want to add to those lists. Those, of course, are the two big ones that these libertarian types will shout out. I'm kind of surprised about Sean, because the little I do know about him is he's sort of an ex-anarcho-capitalist, ex-libertarian, and yet he still has these libertarian beliefs. And there are a lot of people like that. There are a lot of these sort of left libertarian types who believe that you know, the United States government lost these wars. But we have to ask, I guess you could add Iraq to that. So we have to ask, really, or Syria, I don't know. we have to ask, what is the purpose of these wars? What's the goal of these wars? Because we don't live in some period of first dimensional, do they call it first dimensional warfare? Do they call it generation? We don't live in first generation warfare. We don't live in a situation where war is a uniformly simple process whereby an invading army enters into a territory, kind of slaughters the opposition, all the fighting age males, takes, the women and children as slaves, etc., etc., and harvests and extracts resources, and then rules over the people or moves on to the next place. That's not really the nature of war these days, and the reason for that is because we have a bigger geopolitical game at play. Specifically, whenever you're talking about wars in the Middle East, and there's several, there's Iraq, there's Afghanistan, there's Syria, there's Yemen. Okay, when we're talking about wars in the Middle East, we have to bring it back to what are the geostrategic goals of America with regard to the Middle East. Are the geostrategic goals of America with regard to the Middle East to be honest? To be honest. I think people would kind of naturally say, no, the goal is not to be honest. What are you talking about? Of course the United States is going to be Machiavellian. Of course it's going to lie. Of course it's going to employ Sun Tzu type tactics. So I think Sean would understand this. I think he would agree. I think he would say it's a facile point. Why am I bringing it up? Because when Sean looks at the L's of the United States, he tallies the L's next to the W's, he's taking the United States government at its word. And I think that's a very unwise thing to do. I think when you accept the lies of the United States government, you are becoming a liar yourself by extension, by proxy, whether you intend to or not. And of course, I'm using that term liar here hyperbolically and in a clickbaity fashion, as you all know, and as you can complain in the comments section. But in any case, it is hyperbole meant to make an example, of the fact that anyone can fall into these right-wing lies. It doesn't matter how intelligent you are or who you are as a person. What matters is that the goals of the United States of America in the Middle East are not honest, that the United States of America regularly lies to its people, and that the United States of America has no issue, no problem whatsoever in telling the American people we lost. This has been, I think the first big one was Vietnam. But since then, the United States government has had no problem with saying we lost, we failed, it didn't work out, we're not so good, we're not so powerful. The United States government is happy to do that. We have to ask why. Why? Well, even if it's not true, the United States government is happy to say, yes, we lost, we failed, we're weak, because sometimes expressing weakness to say, oh, I couldn't do anything, oh, I couldn't resist. If you heard this before, you go up to someone and you say, why did you do that? Instead of saying something like, well, I have a different set of priorities from you, or I wasn't honest with you, or I wanted to do something I knew you think would be bad, they just say, oh, I was weak, I couldn't resist, So, with regards, let's take Vietnam first for a second. With regards to Vietnam, why did the United States of America leave Vietnam? Is it because the Treasury Department was bankrupt? Is it because the United States government decided that it was going to collapse if it did not pull the troops out of Vietnam? No. There was no necessity to bring the troops out of Vietnam. It was a calculated pros versus cons decision. And you can say, well, therefore the United States government lost. But again, what was the goal in that war? Was the goal in that war to stop communism from taking hold in Vietnam. I would argue that this was a goal of some of the soldiers fighting in that war, but the top brass ultimately, I think, had a different set of priorities. When we look at things like Project MK Ultra, we can see that the United States government viewed that war very differently than the average soldier fighting that war. And so they would put out anti-communist propaganda, and you had the John Birch Society putting out their own propaganda. But ultimately, the purpose of the war was as a training ground, as an exercise gym, as a way for the military-industrial complex to justify its expansion. It was a psychological operations testing ground. It was an area where you could have a My Lai massacre and you could experiment with legal ramifications, public opinion ramifications. You could experiment with how are people going to perceive this, how can we use this, how can we create an anti-government movement, what would it look like, how do we create controlled opposition anti-government movement, because at the time, you have to remember, the Soviet Union was interested in, fomenting a communist revolution in the United States of America. And what was the response to that? Well, the response by the FBI was to fund the feminists. Gloria Steinem, these sort of people were funded as basically FBI agents in the same way that, like, the leader of the Proud Boys is an FBI agent and so on. So at the time, they were less focused on, making patsies out of the right wing. They're more focused on making patsies out of the left wing to create this controlled opposition. So this was an element of the Vietnam War, that you present this American imperialism and that the contrast to it, the ideological contrast, should be feminism, it should be anti-racism, it should be pacifism, it should be all these things. And why did the United States government approve of that as opposed to some kind of like virulent Spartacist Rosa Luxemburg communism? I think the answers are pretty intuitive. And so again, when people say, well, this is a conspiracy theory, that you would suggest that the goals of the Vietnam War at the top levels of decision making were not the same as the stated public rules, I think that itself is a kind of lunacy. I think that itself, we have to ask, what are the incentive structures? We have to do a Foucaultian analysis. We have to ask, what does power want? And we have to look at the evidence, not at the misdirection that's put out there, not at the public statements. I think, if anything, if a public statement is put out by the government, we should assume that the opposite is true. If they say, well, we're going into Vietnam to, the free world and democracy and Christianity, you really think the United States government was there to defend Christianity in Vietnam? You really believe the United States government is controlled by Christians and Christian people who want to protect the Vietnamese Christians or something like that? In fact, when you actually look at the effect of the Vietnam War, they pulled out millions of Vietnamese Christians, imported them into America as part of the mass immigration plan, which depleted Vietnam of its Christian population. Whereas had there been no Vietnam War, Ho Chi Minh would have taken over, but he would have had to strike a deal with the Christians because, the Christians were quite influential at that time. He would have had to say, okay, well, rather than fight a civil war between these Christians and communists, we're going to have to come to some kind of approval. Same thing in North versus South Korea. You had the Christians and you had the communists and whatnot. And without this foreign intervention, they'd probably have to come to some kind of agreement. And a lot of ways that Stalin had to come to an agreement with Christians during the Second World War out of necessity. But that didn't happen because the issue was forced by these intervening powers. So that's a little bit of Vietnam, and we could poke and prod and look at different pieces of evidence and say, well, here was the official government statement on Vietnam, and then compare that to, well, here was what was actually going on in Vietnam. All these things appeared like, and I'm sure there is government incompetence. I don't deny the existence of that. I don't deny the possibility that there can be agents and actors within a hierarchical system that are going to not accomplish their goals. And, you know, that being the case, we have to ask, you know, incompetence, is that something which is a bug or a feature? You know, again, I come back to something like the My Lai massacre, is this famous George Floyd-esque media event where there's an entire victimology. Not to say that people didn't suffer. When I use those words, you know, media event and so on, victimology, I'm not saying that people weren't hurt. I'm not saying that injustice wasn't done. But what I'm saying is that the conditions for that event were created by the government, and then the government walks in all surprise mode and says, whoa, what's going on here? This is crazy. It's like, you know what you were doing. You instructed these people to do this. This is the modus operandi of the war. This is how things are being done. Now you're coming in to present this to a shocked public and to say, look, see, our boys, our troops are really the bad guys. We're the evil empire. We are, you know, Darth Vader. And, you know, you question, why does the government want to make people hate the government? I would say it's because the government, when the government promoted the hippie movement and LSD and the idea of, oh, we're going to, you know, these anti-government movements, they're not against the quote-unquote deep state, as we call it now. They're against the superficial form of government as it presents itself today. They're against the Christian form of government. They're against the this older form of government. And so when the government promotes anti-government memes, usually this is a means of creating an external or exoteric shift to help it correspond with an internal or esoteric shift. To say, well, the government is already anti-Christian, so let's foment an anti-Christian movement in order to bring about that external change among the populace. Anyway, with regard to Afghanistan, if I haven't mentioned already, the goal of America in the Middle East is to destabilize the region. America does not want stable governments to exist in that region unless they're direct puppet states of America. And so, you know, Saudi Arabia is good because Saudi Arabia is controlled by America. Iran is bad because Iran is not. And Iran has a historical role of being hegemonic in the region. So, what is the United States government? What is its prime goal? The prime goal of the United States government in the Middle East is to mess with Iran, to do anything that makes Iran's life more difficult. And so, as a result, the United States government wants to build military bases all around the borders of Iran. So you look at the Iraq War, you look at the Afghanistan War, and it's clear the purpose of these wars is not to bring democracy to the Middle East. The purpose of these wars is not to eliminate the population. The purpose of the war isn't even to extract resources from those countries. Because, frankly, if the United States government wanted to nuke these countries, it could. And that's honestly what you'll hear from a lot of right-tards, or whatever you want to call them. I mean, I've been hearing this for 2 decades now, the people from 9/11 saying, yeah, we gotta nuke the Muslims. If the United States government wanted to do that, they could have done it already. If they wanted to extract the resources, you just send in one of those old diamond mining companies. You send in one of those oil companies to suck the country dry. There's a corporate neo-colonialist method of extracting resources which doesn't require troops on the ground, or at least not so many, or at least not so publicly. You can do it with Blackwater or whatever private corporations. But you give government grants to them and send them in. So what was the goal? The goal was perpetual warfare. The goal was to create a state of unrest. The goal was to create instability. The goal was to create ISIS, right? And I think Sean would probably agree that one of the United States government's goals was to create Al-Qaeda through its funding of bin Laden, and then to create ISIS through its funding of the quote-unquote Syrian rebels. So this is the modus operandi of the United States of America. This is how it acts. This is how it does things. And, it never intended to win those wars in a classical way. It didn't have a classical type eliminate the fighting age males, enslave the women and children, steal the resources. No, none of those were the primary goals of America. And so if you assume, like Trump, or you assume like a right-winger, an engineer brain, you assume that this was the true goal of the United States government, then the United States government looks fantastically incompetent, because it's like, wow, you're not achieving any of your goals. But when you simply reorient the goal away from what the publicly stated goal is, oh, we found a snake, that's cool. Away from the publicly stated goal, and we reorient the goal toward Foucaultian incentive structures, asking, okay, if I was in the situation of the United States government, what would my goal be with respect to Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan? Would I be trying to save Western civilization, save Christianity from communism or radical Islamic terrorism? Would I try to stop 9/11? That's an interesting question. Or would I try to foment another 9/11, right? So you can see that the United States government will say things like, oh, we gotta stop terrorism, and then you look at their actions, it's like, you guys are fomenting terrorism, right? The United States government is the greatest state sponsor of terrorism of all time. And so that's, again, that's not a bug, that's a feature. That's not incompetence, as like a Ron Paul would assume. Ron Paul would be out there saying, we just don't know what we're doing in the Middle East. And, there's a lot of government incompetence and government waste. And you see, the government's very inefficient. This is nonsense. This is a facile view. This is a view that takes the government at its word. This is a view that doesn't correspond with reality. So we have to call it out. We have to call out this right-wing, libertarian, trust the government sort of view that when the government says it's losing a war, when the government states public objectives and then doesn't fulfill those public objectives, that therefore this is evidence that the government has lost the war, the government's incompetent, that we need to protect our gun rights because someday the United States government is going to do with the American people what they've done to the Taliban, and the Taliban tactics are going to work just as well in America. 2 points about that, maybe to end the video and keep it shorter than usual, is to say that with regards to ideology, the United States government is actually not bothered by radical Islam. The United States government is bothered by rural, white, warrior class people, engineers, farmers, South Africa call them Boers. The United States government is bothered by this mentality because the United States government is basically constituted by priest class and merchant class people. So this is a form of class warfare that informs their ideological ferocity, right? They don't care so much about Islam because Islam and the Taliban, they might be warrior class, but they're sort of far away, they're foreign, they're not close to home, they're not close to the heartland. The heartland people in America are what caused the United States government the greatest hatred, not because they're any genuine threat, but because they are spiritually opposed to the United States government. And so, regardless of the actual sort of like in terms of mechanical, strategic force, I guess China is the supposed, what would you call them? The supposed opponent of the United States government, that China would be the top contender. But the US government doesn't actually fear China in the same way, because China can be worked with, because they have a mercantile morality, a mercantile mindset, trying to make money, building up their empire and so on. So they can be dealt with, whereas the rural white warrior class, nominally Christian, that group, while it may be small, while it may be insignificant, while it may not have the resources to overthrow the government, it's still spiritually opposed to the government. And so on a psychological level, the apparatchiks really hate those people. And what I'm trying to say is that in a war with the Taliban, you know, the government forces don't really have their heart in it. I'm not talking about the average troops on the ground. Of course, the average troops on the ground are probably going to feel more alienated by Islam than if they were, you know, fighting in Arkansas. But what I'll say is that the top brass, the decision makers, the people who hire and fire the generals, those are the really important people. Which, by the way, doesn't seem to be Donald Trump, doesn't seem to be the president. Seems to be the deep state. And so these deep state people, if they were to go to war with heartland Americans, not the Taliban, but heartland Americans, the ferocity would be unparalleled in history. You'd have to go back to the biblical example of the Jews genociding the Amalekites or something, that kind of hatred of, we're going to write your name out of history. We're going to make it so that nobody knows who you were. We're going to completely destroy your culture. This is the type of ferocity that I think you would get in that situation, as opposed to this kind of overseas adventure for, you know, geostrategic means of containing Iran. A completely different psychical motivation. Really, the motivation of the United States in the Middle East is a kind of, you know, let's keep the situation stable, let's keep American dominance. It's this mechanistic, imperialistic, you know, moving pieces on a chessboard. But if the government ever fully went to war with its population, you know, all options would be on the table, specifically biological warfare. I think if you don't believe in biological warfare yet, if you don't believe in the efficacy of biological warfare, I think you're living under a rock. And I think this is, if there is a quote-unquote civil war in America, this is the first weapon that will be unleashed. If something like that actually kicks off in a major way and it appears at all real, you're going to have things which are released, which are gene-specific, which require a vaccine to immunize yourself against. And so what the government will do is it will say, all right, for the next 6 months or whatever, we're going to vaccinate everybody who's on our team. And if you don't get this super special secret vaccine from the United States government, then we're going to unleash this thing, and everybody who doesn't have the vaccine will be hit, and they'll be hit hard. And so even if it doesn't kill 100% of the target population within, say, the first, you know, couple months or so, it's going to debilitate people, because if you know, a significant portion of your population is just feeling unwell, if a significant portion of your population is on ventilators or whatever, then you have a problem in a wartime scenario. You can't effectively fight biological warfare. And so I think that's more important than nukes. I think that is going to be the future. Anyway, I hope this video has explained why I believe it is a lie to say the United States government lost in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, or wherever else you can come up with. I think it's a mistake to claim that, and I think that we should instead understand that the public goals of the United States government to spread democracy, to extract resources, to contain the spread of radical Islamic terror, or whatever they are saying publicly to the people to justify the war, that's a PR campaign, and that's completely separate from the actual goals. And the actual goals are usually accomplished, and the actual goals are usually not about resolving warfare, but exacerbating warfare for the purpose of growing the military-industrial complex and using war as a psychological testing ground, as well as creating social change through anti-government movements, which are spurned by the deep state, in the same way that so many so-called leftists today, which is why I call myself on the deep left, because I recognize the superficiality of corporate-controlled leftism, that when all these corporations are using the rainbow flag, that's not leftism, folks. That is the most extreme form of authoritarian right-wing uniformity that you could possibly imagine, right? That is from the top down, deep state cabal, oligarchy, aristocrats saying, this is the poison pill that we want to feed the population to make people hedonistic, to make people compliant. That is the goal there. And so we have to recognize the flaws here, the flaws in the left, the flaws in the right. We have to go a little deeper in our analysis. I appreciate you listening, your time and attention. If you want to get in contact with me personally and have a discussion, you can follow me on Twitter at Jokull, Jokkull. You can mention me, you can create a little Twitter post, put the @ sign at Jokull, and that will pull me up. Until then, until next time, have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.